From our point of view, according to Anatoly Fomenko and myself, chronology is part of applied mathematics. In general, what is history? History is a concept that structures the information passed down to us. This information is contradictory, distorted, and incomplete. The question is, how to organize it, how to eliminate errors, how to distinguish the more reliable parts from the less reliable ones. Errors vary as well. There are accidental errors and intentional errors, and history contains both. What is history? History is information that has been chewed over many times. We are now in the present. We want to understand something about what happened long ago. We do not see it, but someone else saw it and described it somehow. Then that person died, and all the witnesses died. We're talking about ancient times. The description of this event became a text that lives its own life. It exists in the form of some manuscripts. Some parts of it may have burned. Some parts may have disappeared. It gets copied. The copyist doesn't always understand what was written. They might add something of their own, they might misunderstand by accident, or they might distort it deliberately, for example, if there was an agenda. Several people copied a witness's description. Then it got copied again. The descriptions of the same event emerged. After a series of copies, one description got copied along one chain, another along a different chain, and they could become completely different accounts. Moreover, they may have been translated from one language to another, and then back again or to another language entirely. Today, history is an attempt to understand what is contained in this recorded stream of words that has reached us. Historians are simply reading. They read and organize it in their heads in some way. Then they read another text and organize that in their heads. Then they begin to think. This is how they are researching this information. It's based on authorities. Someone said that this is how it happened. This was said by a respectable person. So, we will repeat it. They have developed a certain concept. How this concept was developed is another question. It was not developed randomly either. This concept had its founding fathers. For example, let's look at how medieval artists painted historical scenes. From the point of view of modern history, they painted them incorrectly. Historians had to say that they were ignorant and painted inaccurately. But today's historians believe they understand everything correctly, better than those people who were closer to the events but were supposedly ignorant. Let's take Russian history. Today, we imagine it dressed in a certain way. In school, we learned about Rurik, Yaroslav the Wise, Vladimir. We think we know the clothes they wore, the armor Russian warriors fought in, the shields they carried, and the swords they brandished. All of this is depicted in various paintings and textbooks, and we get used to it. Let's visit the Tretiakov Gallery. There, the display starts by centuries, the 17th century, the 18th century. But it doesn't have to be the Tretiakov Gallery. It's just that the Tretiakov has a large collection. Artists are people who reflect the views of society. They hear and see something and then paint it. They depict it, transferring it onto the canvas. How did artists in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries paint scenes from Russian history? We will see a completely different picture. In the 17th century, I don't know of any paintings on the theme of Russian history. But, for example, in the 18th century, one of the earliest images depicts Prince Sviatoslav dressed in ancient Roman attire, as if he were a Roman. The women around him are also in classical clothes. This is nothing like what we're used to. Let's think about when artistic paintings began to depict Russian history as we understand it today. I'll tell you, it was in the mid-19th century. Before that, they painted differently. This is just a detail, but it's a very telling one. It means that our perception of Russian history only took shape in the mid-19th century, and since then, it has more or less solidified. Today we perceive it as almost absolute truth. But it wasn't always that way. These perceptions come from the works of Nikolai Karamzin. Before Karamzin, things were written differently. In fact, before Karamzin, there was Mikhail Sherbatov's history, where Russian history is described in different terms, with different colors. In terms of volume, Sherbatov's history is considerably larger than Karamzin's. As far as I remember, it was only reprinted twice. The first was during Sherbatov's lifetime, in the late 18th century, and then his heirs privately reprinted it once more in the 19th century. And that was it. To read Sherbatov's history, you have to go to a special section of libraries. How does Sherbatov's history begin? With a preface stating that Russian history is one of the darkest. In general, history is a dark subject, and Russian history is one of the darkest. In reality, Karamzin wrote the preface to his history in the form of an argument with Sherbatov, although he doesn't say so directly. Sherbatov writes, "History is a dark matter, and Russian history is one of the darkest." Karamzin writes, "Russian history is illuminated by numerous sources that leave no room for doubt." Sherbatov writes, "There are no sources, and I have to rely on Polish chronicles and Polish sources. These are the main sources for Russian history." Sherbatov writes this quite directly. Karamzin, on the other hand, writes that the main sources are Russian chronicles. Then Sherbatov writes that the Slavs were warlike. Karamzin, in this part, writes that the Slavs were not warlike, that they played musical instruments and engaged in singing and dancing. So, the texts run directly parallel to each other. Sherbatov begins to reason about ancient times, saying that Russians fought in the armies of Nebuchadnezzar against the Romans. Clearly, Karamzin needed to dispel the impression created by Sherbatov's book and offer a new one, to paint a new picture. In essence, he painted a picture that we today perceive as the authentic view of Russian history. That's what historians do. Therefore, it is necessary to make sense of all this information that has reached us, again I repeat, distorted and incomplete, based on real events, of course, but they are buried somewhere far and deep. First of all, they were described by certain eyewitnesses who could have been biased, who might not have seen everything or recorded everything. Even at the first level, when two eyewitnesses recount the same event, differences already emerge. So, what can we say about the third, fourth, fifth, or 10th level? When we don't even read the words of the eyewitness himself, but the words of someone who saw the text. Then someone else who saw the text of the one who saw the text. And so on. That's what we're reading, through 10th or even 20th hands. Therefore, the question arises. How do we identify those stable, formalized features that are least susceptible to changes? This is the primary task of mathematical analysis in chronology. This is a task of applied mathematics. In general, the task of noisy data analysis is a problem of applied mathematics. And mathematics only learned to solve such problems in the 20th century. Only in the 20th century were methods developed that allowed us to work with significantly distorted information. Today, these methods are well known, but in the early 20th century, they were still in their infancy. So, it's no surprise that chronology underwent this kind of mathematical analysis only in our time. Even Morozov didn't yet have the necessary knowledge or technology to fully understand history. Science was beginning to approach this threshold, but it hadn't yet reached it. He lacked computational tools, and statistics was still in its infancy.
It was considered a branch of physics.
Yes. Morozov had many bright and deep ideas. But the fact that he didn't get the correct answer was objective. It wasn't just because he was the first to process such a large volume of information, and perhaps didn't have enough resources. An entire institute worked for him. But even if 10 times as many people had been working for him, I think he still wouldn't have succeeded. Simply because science hadn't yet reached the level that would allow this problem to be solved.
I had an association that, in some sense, chronology is like the theory of algebraic invariance, which David Hilbert worked on. But there, the transformations were simple and analytical.
That's one of the methods. When we analyze chronology using mathematical statistics, we first formalize and extract features from it. These are not exactly invariants, but something similar to an invariant. These are features that are not influenced by the copyists.
They remain preserved during the transformation.
Yes, they are preserved.
At least, they remain close.
They are invariants with respect to copying. That's true. They aren't rigid invariants, but they are resistant to distortions during transcription. Because historians focus on the most unstable component, emotions. It's emotional. One person is bad, another is good. One wins, another loses. But what does win or lose really mean? The same battle can be a victory for one side from one perspective and a victory for the other side from another perspective.
Take the Battle of Borodino, for example. The French believed they won at Borodino.
They remained on the battlefield. At the Battle of Kursk, the Germans remained on the battlefield. You see? It's complicated. Victory in a war or even in a particular battle, as we read in history, where one person defeated another, isn't always about a victory on the battlefield itself. It's the result of the overall struggle. The outcome can vary. Perhaps the person said to have won, actually lost. But in the end, he triumphed and wrote that he always won. Winners always write history in such a way that they were victorious from beginning to end. Remember the movies from our youth about the Germans? When I was a boy, I went to the cinema. They fought for 5 years. It was a hard-fought war. But if you watch those movies, it's as if the Germans were idiots who immediately ran away. In the films, they're depicted as unserious opponents. Piece of cake. Our hero effortlessly defeats hundreds of German soldiers. You have to understand, that's how it always is. The history that is written is like these movies. History is written by the victors, and on paper, the final winner is always the one who prevails in the last battle. Historians often approach this naively and take the information in texts very literally. And it's clear that not all texts and books say the same thing. Historians themselves admit that some books were written by ignorant people and are full of errors. To understand history, you have to forget the idea of right and wrong books. You must study all the information, knowing that it's contradictory. You need to derive some formal results, figure things out, and establish an order. Only then, with a developed concept, can you see what's right and what's wrong. What do historians do? They already have a preconceived, naive concept from as far back as the 17th century. And relative to this concept, they decide what fits. That becomes the correct source and the right book. What does not fit is deemed the wrong source and wrong book. I'll give you a vivid example of how sources are divided into correct and incorrect depending on the concept. In one concept, a source might be considered correct, but in another, incorrect. And vice versa. In another concept, it might be incorrect, but in this one, it's correct. There is a book by Sir Jerome Horsey, called Notes upon Russia. I don't remember the exact title. It is believed that this book was written by the English merchant Jerome Horsey, who, by the way, was referred to as Yeremy Ulyanov in Russian documents. He describes his life in the book. He was a subject of the English Queen. But there's no mention of any trading in the book. He doesn't seem to know he's a merchant. Historians today know he was a merchant. But he would have been very surprised to hear that. Instead, he is a diplomat serving an emperor. The first few pages talk about how he visited many countries and met many different rulers. But he serves an emperor, even though he's a subject of the English Queen. The question is, which emperor? From the historian's point of view, at that time, in the 16th century, there was only one emperor, Emperor Habsburg, whom he must have been serving. There was no other emperor in Europe. But after a few pages, it becomes clear that when Jerome Horsey talks about an emperor, he means the Tsar of Moscow. He doesn't even clarify this, nor does he write, by emperor I mean the Tsar of Moscow, and that the other emperor isn't legitimate. That's what he should have written, something along those lines. So, he has a different opinion. Let's say he doesn't want to call Habsburg the emperor and prefers to call the Tsar of Moscow by that title. Well, he could have just written that. But no, he doesn't even understand that there might be another emperor. From his book, it is clear that for him, the emperor is the Tsar of Moscow, and this fact doesn't need explaining. He doesn't know any other emperor. He is a subject of the English Queen, serving the emperor and carrying out his diplomatic missions. There's a vivid example. During the Livonian War, the emperor orders him to bring saltpeter for gunpowder. The emperor is short on gunpowder. He is waging war with the western regions, Germany, Poland, and so-called Livonia. Today, Livonia is thought of as a small region. But from Jerome Horsey's description, it is clear that Livonia essentially refers to Western Europe, the regions with which the emperor is waging war. And he doesn't have enough gunpowder. He wants gunpowder to be brought from England. He sends Jerome Horsey to the English Queen with a message. Horsey proudly writes about how he cleverly hid this message somewhere, in a flask that he tied to the horse's neck and filled with wine or something else. I don't remember the details exactly, but with great difficulty, he cunningly concealed this message, because along the way to England, rebels and opponents searched him many times. In the end, he delivers the emperor's message to the English Queen, who stands and listens to the letter. Then she begins discussing with Horsey how he managed to sneak it through, laughing. She's glad the letter arrived, and soon she equips ships and sends the saltpeter. Jerome Horsey accompanies these ships. Via the northern Dvina route, he arrives in Moscow and brings the Queen's reply to the emperor. But he doesn't present it to the emperor directly, he hands it over to some officials. Through the bureaucratic chain, it eventually reaches the emperor. After this, Horsey was rewarded. 150 nobles brought various gifts. But there's no mention of any prepayment or money involved. He received an order, fulfilled it, and was rewarded. If he hadn't fulfilled it, he wouldn't have been rewarded. There's no mention at all of any money paid for the saltpeter. Jerome Horsey doesn't bring it up in his book. He assumes that if the emperor orders something, it must be done, and if the emperor deems it necessary to show gratitude, then he will. These are the kinds of relations Jerome Horsey describes between the emperor and, in this case, the English Queen. But this absolutely doesn't fit with modern history. Historians say, the book is strange and inaccurate. After all, there are many other books where history is described the way they imagine it.
For example, Herberstein, right?
Partially. There are many such features in Herberstein's writings as well. No, not Herberstein. There are other books. But here's what I want to say. There are sources that describe history the way historians believe it happened, and there are other sources that describe even relatively recent history, like the 16th century, in an entirely different way. So, who's right? Historians say, of course, we are right, and Horsey is either ignorant or mentally unwell, or something along those lines. In short, from their point of view, his book is not reliable. Maybe it's interesting in certain aspects, but it's not trustworthy. Some parts of it are fantasies or something of that sort. The very act of dividing sources into correct and incorrect already implies that you know the answer. You already know what the correct history is, and from that standpoint, you can categorize sources as accurate or inaccurate. But what if we simply want to find out what the history was really like? We have a range of sources. One says one thing, another says something else. If we want to uncover the true history, we cannot divide them into correct and incorrect ahead of time. We need to investigate all the information. Only after analyzing all the data can a concept emerge that allows us to classify sources as reliable or unreliable. That's exactly what we're doing, and in the process, a different concept arises, one that differs from that of historians. In our concept, for instance, Jerome Horsey's book becomes correct, while the books that historians consider accurate become incorrect.